The views expressed in this course are those of the professor and do not necessarily reflect the position or policy of the teaching company LLC, the U.S. Naval War College, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
Welcome back. While certainly the most famous, The Art of War is far from the only important text in China's strategic canon. If anything, the book's most important contribution to military thought in ancient China came from sparking intense debates over military leadership, as well as the utility of force and the relationship between statecraft and warfare. In fact, this book's early fame derived as much from its detractors as from its disciples. As I've argued previously, the Sun Tzu is likely a product of the late Warring States period, around the end of the 4th century BCE. I say that because the scale of warfare and the explicit references to crossbows in the book track best with that particular period. In addition, we only start to hear of a book called the Sun Tzu in other texts that date to the 3rd century BCE or later. The Wu Tzu, a political military treatise attributed to Wu Qi, a strategist who served the kingdom of Chu and lived in the early 4th century, about 100 years after Sun Wu. That book's clearly of later authorship, but we can tell absolutely it's a response to the Sun Tzu. You may also remember Master Han Fei from our statecraft lecture. He's the legalist advisor to China's first emperor. Han Fei, living in the 200s BCE, was familiar with both Master Sun and Master Wu, but wasn't a fan of either. He bemoaned the fact that despite both books being popular, there was a conspicuous shortage of good generals. The first archaeological evidence we have of Sun Tzu comes from the Intuishan tombs. These are resting places for Western Han nobility, so they lived roughly a century after the short-lived Qin dynasty. That provides good reason for us to conclude that at the time, the Sun Tzu was an established classic. That would have been in the 2nd century BCE. We think even more so because that tomb contained writings from a second Master Sun. This is Sun Bin. He's supposed to have lived in the 4th century and is a disciple of our original master. But clearly that book is also of later authorship. Sun Bin is said to have studied personally under the mysterious Gui Guzi, the master of Ghost Valley, who advocated a style of manipulative diplomacy that would have made Machiavelli blush. Gui Guzi claimed that he could recite the Sun Tzu from memory, and he instilled that respect in his young disciple, Sun Bin. But as appealing as the Sun Tzu was, it didn't immediately win over most 4th and 3rd century readers. This might seem strange given the Sun Tzu's status in the canon of Chinese and world strategic literature. But remember, the Sun Tzu is a forceful assault on both the warrior aristocracy's pretensions and on what it perceived as naive Confucian moralism. These critiques didn't go unanswered. Early responses to the Sun Tzu fell into 2 camps. The first rejects Master Sun outright. The second, however, tries to moderate his more extreme positions. In the first camp, we have a book called The Debate on the Principles of Warfare, attributed to a certain Master Xun, who critiques the art of war from a Confucian angle. Xunzi, a graduate of the famous Jisha Academy in Sun Wu's home state of Qi, lived in the last decades of the Warring States period. Master Xun is considered one of Confucius's most important disciples. He revitalized moral philosophy in an age when it seemed that hearkening back to the moral exemplars of a semi-mythic past seemed utterly naive, but he managed to pull it off. Remember, the cutthroat world of the late Warring States was dominated by schools of thought like legalism. So Master Xun was less concerned with the conduct of war than the moral qualities of the ruler, and rejected a core Sun Tzuian tenet, that is, the autonomy of the professional commander. Instead, Xunzi reasserts the role and the sole authority of the ruler over all matters of statecraft, including war. So the very existence of this debate speaks eloquently to the changes taking place in warring states' intellectual culture. A new space was being created where military matters were as thoroughly examined and debated as traditional topics. In contrast to Sun Tzu, the military methods of Master Wu, attributed to the Chu statesman I mentioned earlier, gives us a more subtle critique of the Sun Tzu. Master Wu was a minister and general who served the state of Chu roughly a century after Sun Wu's time. At first glance, there seems to be little difference between the two. Many of Wu's maxims seem straight out of the Sun Tzu, but a close reading exposes critical differences. Unlike Sun Wu, whose existence is debatable, Wu Qi's military credentials are historically attributed, and the text strikes a middle course between three poles: the extreme anti-heroic and amoral approach of the Sun Tzu, the Confucius moral compass, and the martial virtue craved by the aristocracy. And where Sun Tzu seems downright hostile to the ruler, Wu Tzu returns the ruler to a central position. It also puts a more human face on soldiers and officers. In many ways, the Wu Tzu accepts the new reality that motivates the Sun Tzu, but seeks to make it more palatable to an ancient Chinese audience. That the Sun Tzu and its critics were enshrined as classics in China's strategic canon should really lead us to admire the dynamism of ancient Chinese strategic thought, especially that the concept that battle is only a means to an end, not an end in itself. These classics also enshrine the importance of thinking holistically about using force. While Western contemporaries like Thucydides, Xenophon, Caesar, and Marcus Aurelius were definitely pondering these topics, it really wasn't until the Renaissance, just 500 years ago, that a similar canon of strategic thought coalesced in Europe. China, therefore, had a 1,500-year head start when it came to cultivating the strategic analysis and critical thinking that underlie modern professional military education. But most of the Chinese strategic classics familiar to Western audiences come from the Warring States period. When China was unified, first under the short-lived Qin and then under the Han Dynasty, which runs from roughly 200 BCE to 200 CE, discussions of war, strategy, and generalship changed. In the early Han, a certain prince, Liu An, ruler of a fiefdom called Huainan, gathered the leading experts and all the seminal texts on statecraft, philosophy, and war. He gathered them at his court, where the scholars debated the pivotal issues of the day. The result of these meetings was the Huainanzi, named in honor of the prince, the master of Huainan. Liu An's experts endorsed much of Master Sun's strategic advice, especially when it came to exploiting the physical environment and creating shi. After all, the Han had come to power thanks in large part to its ability to field well-organized, professionally led armies like the Sun Tzu envisions. But on topics like war's purpose, the utility of deception, and a general's required traits, there are sharp disagreements. Where the Sun Tzu advocates employing the military only when there's a tangible profit to be gained, the Huainanzi seeks nobler reasons for taking up arms. And while a strong, well-funded, and well-led military was important, Liu An didn't consider it the greatest affair of the state. As for deception, which the Sun Tzu defines as the essence of the military methods, well, to Liu An, such underhandedness was far more problematic under a stable, legitimate dynasty. So while the Sun Tzu and other early military classics were clearly influential in early imperial China, they were far from strategic scripture, especially when the political and strategic context had changed. A pivotal moment in the process of enshrining the Sun Tzu in China's strategic pantheon came ironically with Sun Wu's inclusion in the biographical section of a book called the Shiji, The Records of the Grand Historian, written by Sima Fa in the early 1st century BCE. That's a few decades after those Intuishan burials. So, great news, right? Finally, the greatest of all Chinese historians is about to tell us all about General Sun. But alas, we search in vain for much insight into Sun Tzu's strategic thinking. Sima Qian's approach to biography was didactic. The grand historian provides little detail on the lives or deeds of his subjects, focusing instead on revealing vignettes that capture their moral character. As we've seen, General Sun's military bona fides were based on his alleged service as a Wu commander under King Helu at the end of the 6th century BCE. Sima Qian acknowledges that service and notes his successes, but most of the biography is concerned with the interview, that initial interview that Sun Tzu had with King Helu. Well, remember that interview. Helu kind of mockingly asks Sun Tzu if he can turn palace women into soldiers. What follows might be an effective lesson in discipline and in the general's professional autonomy, but I question the veracity of this story, especially because a true military professional would probably scoff at the idea that a single successful demonstration of rudimentary military drill equates to actual combat effectiveness. But it's the only biography we have, albeit an unflattering one, in my opinion. Master Sun's reputation, however, recovered significantly a couple hundred years later, thanks to praise from the famous poet, diplomat, and warlord Cao Cao. Born around 150 CE, Cao Cao was a cultured aristocrat, equally famous for his poetry as for his strategic genius. Living through the chaotic decline of the Han Dynasty, a period kind of like Warring States 2.0, Cao Cao's commentaries on the Sun Tzu were regularly appended to later versions of the original. An endorsement of the Sun Tzu's literary and strategic merits by one of the pivotal figures in Chinese history immeasurably helped ensure the book's survival and transmission to later generations. But we have to remember that while ancient China's elite were highly literate, books themselves were rare, expensive, and stored on perishable media. It wasn't until the 10th century Song Dynasty that mass-produced paper and woodblock printing enabled the widespread proliferation of books. In Europe, it wasn't until the Renaissance, again, that similar technology emerged. As such, the Western classics that survive from antiquity represent only a fraction of all the works written in ancient Greece and Rome. In China, more classics survived thanks to better technology and greater political continuity. For example, Imperial China largely avoided a dark age. But still, the surviving Warring States texts only represent the tip of a literary iceberg. We also need to realize that Cao Cao, a famously literate military commander, was an exception to the rule. In both China and the West, we tend to focus on either the generals that write their own histories, like Thucydides and Frederick the Great, or on the military leaders that literate societies wrote about, like Attila the Hun or Genghis Khan. Throughout time, most generals have been either illiterate or left unrecorded by history. That was equally true in China, at least until the late imperial period when the military classics were added to the imperial exam system. But even then, those that passed the written military exams were just a fraction of all military officers. Moreover, just because a text is considered a military classic, that doesn't mean that it dictates how soldiers plan and execute campaigns. Think about it this way. It's the same way that the Bible doesn't necessarily explain the behavior of Christians throughout history. What would Jesus think of the Crusades or the Spanish Inquisition? As such, we need to be cautious about assuming that since Sun Tzu is included in China's strategic canon, that it's some kind of definitive text in something we might call a Chinese or Asian strategic culture. This is equally dangerous for Western observers trying to understand China today. Because of accidents of history and our general lack of knowledge of China, and especially of its military history, the Sun Tzu is often the only Chinese text known to Westerners. As a result, we frequently assume that it's the epitome of the Chinese strategic mind. It doesn't help that this is how many publishers market their translations. If anything, the Sun Tzu is far more central to Western conceptions of the Chinese way of war than it has ever been to the actual conduct of war in Chinese history. In fact, one searches in vain for more than a few dozen references to the text in Chinese battle and campaign histories. That doesn't necessarily mean that Chinese strategists didn't know about Sun Tzu, but rather that history in China was a political project, written by officials of a new dynasty, justifying their ruling house's rise to power. Given the mandate of heaven concept, those official historians were at pains to contrast the moral superiority and competent statecraft of their rising dynasty to the moral decay and organizational incompetence of the declining dynasty that they're replacing. As such, the outcomes of battles marking dynastic transitions, at least in the histories, come across as foregone conclusions. As such, we don't have much direct evidence for Sun Tzuan influence on China's greatest generals. At the same time, that very lack of evidence can be interpreted as proof of the Sun Tzu's pervasive influence. Why do I say that? Well, think of it this way. If history is mostly recording battles where outcomes seem all but certain, even if there's no evidence of Master Sun being invoked, someone might still conclude that all successful Chinese generals throughout time are channeling Sun Tzu chapter and verse, able to completely outthink and outmaneuver their hapless foes. But that begs a question. Wouldn't many of their foes also be Chinese and students of the Sun Tzu themselves? As we'll see in a subsequent lecture, this image of the Sun Tzu as the epitome of the Chinese strategic mind was reinforced by the ways in which and the points at which the Sun Tzu has garnered significant Western attention. We'll also look at the ways that it's been deployed, not so much to explain an authentic Chinese strategic culture, but to construct an Asian alter ego to an essentialized Western way of war. But if China's generals weren't reading Sun Tzu, who was? Given the book's emphasis on organizational expertise, it's going to be naturally appealing to bureaucrats. After all, they're the ones recruiting, paying, equipping, and feeding those large standing armies. The Sun Tzu's endurance as a classic might have more to do with the value it held for civilian bureaucrats than its fan base within China's military. As we'll see, this undercuts a common perception that Chinese states historically privileged the civil aspects of governance over the martial. In addition, the fact that military history in China was primarily written by government functionaries rather than the commanders themselves, albeit with some notable exceptions like Cao Cao, a Sun Tzuan emphasis on methodical planning and execution in the recorded history is going to make sense, right? But more on that in a bit. The next step in Sun Tzu's canonization came in the 11th century CE, when the Song Dynasty Emperor Shenzong selected our text for inclusion in his compendium of his picks for the 7 authoritative classics on strategy and war. These are the 7 military classics. Also included were 4 other warring states texts. We're familiar with the Wuzi, then there's the Taigong and the Sima Fa. The last one's the Methods of the Charioteer. The last one from the warring states is the Wei Liaozi. The sixth of these 7 military classics is from the early Han. It's called The 3 Strategies of Huang Shigong, which bears a strong resemblance to Taigong's 6 Secret Teachings. The 7th classic is called Questions and Replies between Tang Taizong and Li Weigong, which is essentially a strategic dialogue between an early Tang Dynasty emperor and one of his leading generals. The inclusion of that last one, the Tang Dynasty one, makes sense, because the Tang Dynasty significantly expanded both the civil service examination system as a way to recruit bureaucrats. They'd also added a military selection system, which had some academic content, but focused more on physical rather than mental aptitude for military officers. But the subsequent Song Dynasty, they made the civil service exams the sole path into the bureaucracy and established a parallel system for the military. And they used these 7 military classics, the Wujing Qishu, as the curriculum. The Song had many reasons to cultivate a smart and literate military officer class. For one, Song was just one of many states in a complex multipolar Asia. To their east was a powerful Korean state. To the north, they faced pressure from semi-nomadic Khitans. West and southwest were the equally aggressive Tonga, Tibetan, and Dali kingdoms, while further south was the rising power of Dai Viet. 11th century warfare also demanded significant organizational skill, and combat was increasingly high-tech. Complex weapons, siege machinery, and most importantly, gunpowder. The myth that Chinese invented gunpowder and then used it for fireworks only, that's totally false. The Song was also trying to coup-proof their dynasty, making sure their senior officers were carefully vetted on books that honed their strategic skills and that also reinforced their loyalty to the emperor. But still, only a handful of Song senior officers passed the triennial military exams. The majority came up through the ranks or from hereditary military families. The military exams, still employing the 7 military classics, but also testing mastery of contemporary tactics and technology, were made more robust under the Ming Dynasty, dates 1368 to 1644 CE. But again, graduates were limited in number. Large parts of the Ming military were commanded by palace eunuchs, trusted agents of the emperor, rather than by an independent military caste. This included the eunuch admiral Zheng He, who commanded the Ming treasure fleets on their epic voyages to Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. Despite being commonly viewed as militarily inept, the Ming Dynasty was anything but, especially in the late 1500s, when Ming armies and navies embraced the gunpowder revolution and for several decades dominated the strategic scene in East Asia. This military renaissance ignited significant interest in the study of strategy and military history among China's civilian elite, a vogue that re-energized interests in the military classics across society. This civilian engagement in strategic studies flies in the face of one of the stereotypes of Chinese military culture that dominated the discourse in the 19th and 20th centuries. That was a time when China's repeated military defeats by Western imperial powers, this is the century of humiliation, most humiliating were the defeats by Japan. Well, that all convinced many in China and in the West that Chinese civilization simply lacked a traditional martial ethos. Many pointed to an old Chinese adage that good men are not used for soldiers as good iron is not used for nails. This adage was read as a cultural explanation for China's military weakness. The assumption was that Chinese dynasties historically kept their best men, the good iron, for one, that is, civil tasks, such as the imperial bureaucracy. What this meant was that China was well governed internally, but the lack of good men available for Wu or the martial tasks rendered the country vulnerable to aggression by more martial civilizations. The disparaging tone of the good iron adage also speaks to a perception that the military and military service had historically been disdained by civilian elites in China. However, the veracity of the good iron concept doesn't hold up to much scrutiny. First, from the Bronze Age to at least the 10th century CE, China had a warrior class, which competed against and collaborated with the civilian bureaucracy. So rather than a sharp dichotomy between Wen and Wu, there is the Wen Dao and the Wu Dao, the civil way and the martial way. They're two subsets of the larger Wang Dao, the kingly way, the way of statecraft. After all, the Sun Tzu is as much an assault on Confucian moralists as it is an argument against the privileges of the warring state's warrior aristocracy. The Sun Tzu, from its very beginning, is trying to strike a balance between the two extremes, trying to knit together the civil and the martial. Even during the Song dynasty, when many civilian elites professed a decidedly anti-military Neo-Confucian orthodoxy, the martials continued to work in symbiosis with the civil. For example, from the late 10th century to the early 12th century, the Song waged a series of wars against a people called the Tongans in Central Asia. In those wars, the Chinese mobilized more than 1 million troops to face down around 800,000 Tongans. As to the civilian officials' disdain for military men, there are certainly abundant examples of that, especially in the late Ming Dynasty when the Confucian bureaucracy rebelled against the military adventurism of their own emperor. But those were more policy disputes than deeply ingrained cultural inclinations. Someone still enamored of this good iron myth might concede all that, but still argue that Wu matters most, or martial matters most, in the founding of dynasties, the time when you need more good men to be soldiers. But gradually the balance shifts to the one. Dynasties endure because the civil gains ascendance, or as put to me once by a Chinese friend, China may have been conquered from horseback, but it has never been ruled from horseback. And yet, we see examples of martial vigor well into the reigns of China's last two dynasties, the Ming and the Qing. During the Imjin Wars of the 1590s, Ming armies, 200 years after the dynasty's founding, were still professionally led and well-equipped with standardized firearms. They were supported by artillery, cavalry, and naval forces. And they were conducting operations requiring immense and complicated logistics. During the Taiping and Muslim rebellions that ravaged the 19th century Qing dynasty, civilian officials like Zheng Guofan and Li Hongjiang rose admirably to the job of organizing and leading armies against the rebels. As well-educated elites, those two Qing literati would certainly have been familiar with China's military classics and may have sought inspiration in their pages. But they're equally interested in the latest Western military technology and doctrine, as were their Taiping opponents. Li Hongjiang and Zheng Guofan may very well also have had on their bookshelves Sun Xingyan's edition of the Sun Tzu. To many, Sun Xingyan's Sun Tzu is the definitive Chinese version. Samuel Griffith, whose rendering of The Art of War remains assigned reading at U.S. military schools, used Sun Xingyan as his baseline. Sun was an early 19th century scholar and a purported descendant of the original Sun Wu. He closely edited and, to his mind, rectified some of the errors he'd seen in standard versions dating back as far as the Song dynasty. He also went out of his way to argue that General Sun Wu not only existed, but that his deeds as a military commander are reflected in the book itself. In these assertions, however, Sun Xingyan would have been an outlier. 19th century Chinese literati were serious students of history, and few of them believed that there was any definitive evidence of specific authorship of The Art of War. Most scholars outside of China today remain equally skeptical on those topics, but many popular treatments of the book, including in contemporary China now, still like to attribute its teachings to a flesh and blood sage with a proven record of battlefield success. So, Sun Xingyan's mission to repackage the wisdom of his ancient ancestor for a contemporary audience is proof positive that Sun Tzu hagiography started long before these 13 chapters became a Western pop culture phenomenon. At the same time, we need to remember that the Qing, China's last imperial dynasty, was a hybrid empire. The Qing originated among Manchuria's semi-nomadic tribes. As Manchu cavalry advanced south toward the Ming frontiers, they increasingly incorporated infantry tactics into their military doctrine. True to Sun Tzu's maxim to know the enemy, know thyself, the Manchus had the 7 military classics, as well as contemporary Ming military manuals, translated into their native tongue. As we'll see in future lectures, those translations of classical Chinese into Manchu was a major turning point in the Sun Tzu's transmission to the rest of the world. The Ming dynasty was ultimately overthrown by an internal rebellion, after which Manchu armies swept in and incorporated former Ming territory into a vast multi-ethnic empire. As with many conquerors, what might once have been a grudging respect for their foes rapidly turned to disdain. The Emperor Kangxi was clearly not a fan of traditional Chinese strategic thinking. In war, the Qing emperor opined, it's experience of action that matters. The so-called 7 military classics, books that Kangxi's predecessors had translated into Manchu, are, he said, full of nonsense about water and fire, lucky omens, and advice on the weather, all at random and contradicting each other. I told my officials, he said. I told them once that if you followed these books, you'd never win a battle. Kangxi's skepticism shows that while Chinese civilization enjoyed a head start on the West when it came to teaching strategic studies to both civilian and military professionals, this never created a strategic orthodoxy, much less a strategic consensus. In subsequent lectures, we'll continue discussing the Sun Tzu's influence on Chinese strategic thought, looking at the book's role in warfare and strategy in the 20th and 21st centuries, and explore what happened when the Sun Tzu went global. For now, though, a few closing thoughts on the Sun Tzu's complex history in ancient and pre-modern China. It's obviously an iconic text, so it's understandable to think that if we Westerners know about it, it must approach scriptural status in China. In fact, scripture might be a good analogy. We could think of China's military classics as gospels, different and often competing interpretations of war and strategy in Chinese history. Interpretations that scholars have debated for centuries. And like the New Testament, China's military classics are a body of texts that provide guides for thinking and acting in the world, but are not a guarantee that readers will act in accordance with their teachings. Another challenge with gauging the Sun Tzu's historical influence in China derives from the way that traditional military history was written. That tradition denies us much detail of how wars were actually planned and waged. Add to that the all-too-human confirmation bias. Whereas in the absence of contradictory evidence of successful generals not following Master Sun, or unsuccessful generals still adhering to his teachings, well, some may simply assume that mastering the master, or lack thereof, explains the outcome of every battle throughout Chinese history. Therefore, as students of strategic theory, we need to be humble. The most influential works of Western strategic thought, Thucydides, Machiavelli, and Clausewitz, for example, are more important to academics than they are to professional military officers. In the United States, which boasts one of the most literate and best educated militaries in world history, most of our officers are only exposed to the serious study of strategic theory several years into their careers, and then for most of them, only for a short time. So as much as we like to measure strategic behavior against theory, we need to remember that theory is at best an artificial construct to help us understand reality. It's little surprise then that someone like Han Feizi, the pragmatic prime minister of Qin, in the chaotic and blood-soaked world of the late Warring States period, and Kangxi, an emperor on horseback in the process of carving out one of the greatest empires in world history, would not have much patience for some pointy-headed academic like me quoting from the Sun Tzu as a practical answer to their real-world problems. After all I'm good at is 纸上谈兵, discussing war on paper. I'll see you next time.